But this is Dr. Mathews from Memphis Theological Seminary.
It's great to be here. Thank you, David and Gwen, for the invitation. I need to get back on the radio with you folks again soon. I've been on twice. I'm very, very excited for the ministry that you folks are doing in our city. If I weren't excited, I wouldn't be here. And I don't accept a whole lot of speaking invitations these days, but these kinds I do. Because I'm a long-time advocate of same-sex equality, and feel like as a theologian of the church, I have an obligation to correct the record. Because the church has inflicted so much harm, so much destruction, and so much damage in the lives of the LGBT community that it's not enough simply to stop talking bad. You've got to start talking good. So that brings me out this evening. Can you all hear me okay? Is that okay? Good. Quinn did a marvelous job rehearsing for us some of the recent political accomplishments that those of us in this movement have celebrated. Recently, of course, the striking down of the DOMA. And most recently, of course, the one we're still all basking in the glory of, the Supreme Court ruling that same-sex couples are entitled to marriage the same way that opposite-sex couples are. I've spent a lot of my life working very much, waiting, as many of you have, for that day. But as a theologian, what strikes me as I observe the kind of landscape that we are in is that a whole lot of the language that we've been using lately about marriage is the language of rights. Who has a right to marry? What am I legally entitled to? What is that nest of privileges that come to married couples? And should same-sex couples have them or not? And of course, the Supreme Court has answered that question, at least at some level, though I suspect there will be battles yet to fight. But as a theologian, I am interested in more this evening than simply the language of rights. Because when I read the Bible, and when I read it from cover to cover, and I look about what the Bible teaches us about marriage, it doesn't use the word rights. I believe that these rights are important. They're important in a democracy. And they're very important for all the reasons that Gwen spelled out for us. But as a Christian people, as a people of faith, there's more to marriage than just rights. And that's what I want to spend some time this evening talking about. I circulated a little bit of a scary outline, but I will note that I only have 5 points, unlike David who had 6. But it gave me an hour, I guess, so you'll have to endure me at least for a good bit of that time. And I do want to save some time at the end for questions and answers, or conversations, and to get you folks maybe some theological ways of thinking about the journey of marriage. Let me begin by saying, as I said, that when I read the Bible from cover to cover, I never find the language of marriage talked about in terms of rights. How do we as Christian people envision marriage? Well, I think we get a clue when we begin to read the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, when we hear the story of God coming and initiating a relationship of salvation with God's people Israel. That profound act of a God who comes and joins God's self with a single people to redeem them. An act initiated in love, a partnership. And when the ancient Hebrew people looked around in their life experience looking for a metaphor to talk about the relationship they had with God, what metaphor did they settle on? They settled on the metaphor of marriage. In the Hebrew Bible, God is described as a husband, and Israel is God's wife. So there is an important moment in our Christian and biblical heritage that marriage is an analogy to the relationship that God has with God's people. And the marks and the characteristics of that relationship between God and God's people are in some sense the paradigm or the model for our marital relationships to one another. And so what I want to do tonight is talk about that, kind of mind and think together about that relationship of covenant between two people that mirrors the relationship of God and God's people in Israel and the church. It's in the New Testament as well. When New Testament writers like Paul and John and the other authors of the Gospels looked for a metaphor to talk about the most important relationship that they had with God. They chose, again, the metaphor of the bride and the groom. That Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride. So across the canon, across the whole of Scripture, there is this tight connection between our relationship to one another in marriage and the relationship that God has with God's people. So let's think a little bit tonight, in the time we have here, about marriage as a covenant. And I want to argue that that covenant that we enter into is rooted and grounded in the life of God, and in many ways is modeled on God's own life. And secondly, I want to talk about how that covenant that we're invited into is both a gift that God gives us to delight in. I've been married for almost 20 years now, and most of the time, it's been a delight. Just being honest, most of the time, it's been a delight. And at times that it's not, points to my last point that marriage is not simply a gift, it's a task. It's a calling. It's a struggle that we work at every day. And our theology as Christians needs to honor kind of both moments there, gift and task. So let me begin by talking about a covenant. My definition of marriage, which I offer in a provisional way, is this, that marriage is a unique partnership that reflects the covenantal relationship between God and God's people. This covenant of marriage is both a gift and a task. So let's think a little bit about that covenant. It is a covenant that God establishes that's initiated in love. We all know that love lies at the heart, or ought to lie at the heart of marriage. And we throw that term love around quite a lot in our culture, and I think sometimes that we really haven't done much thinking about what it is. Love, often in our society, is confused with infatuation, or with lust, or with a kind of immediate emotional attachment to something that fades over time. But love, as the Bible defines it, and as I'm going to define it, is rather a settled and abiding disposition. A settled and abiding disposition to delight in and celebrate the goodness of one's beloved. You hear that? It's a settled and abiding disposition. It's not a fleeting feeling from time to time. It's a settled and abiding disposition. It becomes a mark of one's character, in which I delight in and contribute to the well-being of my beloved other. That's pretty countercultural stuff. Because there are many folks who think of their sexuality, who think of their relationships primarily as about that place where I get something, right? Perhaps I get sexual gratification. Perhaps I get prestige. Perhaps I get social status if I'm married. But love is not primarily concerned about the self. It's concerned about the other. And here's the thing. To love somebody means to honor their otherness, to honor their difference from you, right? When I get in trouble in my own marriage, it's usually in one of those places where I'm trying to turn my wife into a clone of myself, right? But if she would just drive this way, if she would just think this way, if she would just